My brother walked into the conference room like he owned it, which, as far as he knew, he did. He had flown in from Austin the night before, checked into the nicest hotel downtown, and apparently spent the morning having his shoes shined before what he called the biggest day of his career. I know this because he texted our mother at 7:42 a.m., and our mother, who had not spoken to me in 4 months, forwarded the text to me with 3 exclamation points and no other context. I was already in the building when he arrived. I had been there since 8. Nobody noticed me because nobody ever does. I was standing near the back of the reception area, holding a padfolio and wearing the kind of blazer that reads as mid-level support staff if you're not paying attention. My brother walked past me without breaking stride. He didn't recognize me. That's not as strange as it sounds. He hadn't looked directly at me in years, not since I stopped being useful to him, which was roughly around the time I stopped lending him money. His name is Colin. He is 39 years old. He has the kind of confidence that you get not from earning things, but from never being told no. Our father had been telling him yes his entire life, and our father's money had been doing the same. And when our father's money finally ran out, Colin had found other people to keep saying it. Today, those people were in this building, and so was I. Let me back up. Growing up, Colin and I were raised in the same house by the same 2 parents, which sounds like it should mean we had similar childhoods. We didn't. Our father, his name is Dennis, and I'll use it because calling him my father implies a warmth that doesn't exist. Dennis had a theory about children. He believed that potential was visible early, the way you can tell a good cut of meat from a bad one before you even get it near the fire. He decided, sometime when Colin was around 7 and I was 5, that Colin had it and I didn't. Colin was loud, charismatic. He could walk into a room and make adults laugh. He played baseball well enough to get noticed, though not well enough to go anywhere with it. He failed algebra twice, and Dennis hired a tutor both times. He crashed his car at 17, and Dennis replaced it without making him work a single weekend shift. He dropped out of his second college after a semester, and Dennis called it finding himself. I was quiet. I read a lot. I got good grades without anyone asking me to, which Dennis interpreted not as competence, but as a lack of ambition. Anyone can make A's if they're boring enough to spend Friday nights studying, he told me once, when I was 12, and I didn't have the vocabulary yet to explain how wrong that was. When I graduated high school with a full academic scholarship, Dennis asked me what I planned to do with a business degree. When I told him I wanted to go into finance, specifically corporate restructuring, he laughed, not meanly, just dismissively, like I'd said something cute. Colin, that same year, had just launched his 3rd business venture. Dennis had funded the first 2. This one was an event planning company that catered to corporate clients, and Dennis had put in $60,000 in startup capital without blinking. The company lasted 14 months. I put myself through college. I worked as a paralegal's assistant and a weekend bookkeeper, and I graduated with honors and 0 debt. And Dennis sent me a congratulations card that Colin had clearly signed on his behalf because the handwriting didn't match. I went to work for a consulting firm that specialized in distressed assets. It's not glamorous work. It's not the kind of thing that makes people's eyes light up at dinner parties. What we do, essentially, is this. We find companies that are failing, and we figure out why. And then we either help them stop failing, or we help someone else acquire them for less than they're worth, strip out whatever's valuable, and let the rest dissolve. It requires a very specific combination of patience and ruthlessness, and I turned out to be good at it. Dennis never asked what I did for work. Not once. Not in 11 years. Colin, however, had been paying close attention. Not to my career. He couldn't have told you what I did if you'd offered him money, but to something adjacent to it. Colin had become, in the past few years, increasingly interested in private equity, specifically in the kind of deals where you buy into a partnership and then collect returns while other people do the actual work. He liked the idea of money making money. He liked the idea of a title. He liked the idea of being the kind of person who got invited to things. He'd been circling a firm called Meridian Capital Group for almost 2 years. They were a mid-sized private equity outfit out of Nashville, and they had a reputation for being selective about their partners. Colin talked about them constantly. He talked about them at Christmas. He talked about them at Dennis's birthday dinner last spring, where he monopolized the conversation for 40 minutes while I sat at the far end of the table eating bread and listening to him explain incorrectly how carried interest works. The partnership buy-in was $200,000. Colin didn't have it. Colin had never had $200,000 at one time in his life. But he had something almost as good. He had Dennis, and Dennis had his retirement account. And Dennis, who was 67 years old and had spent 4 decades working in commercial insurance, had managed to accumulate just under $800,000 in a rollover IRA that he'd been careful with and never touched. Until now. I found out about the plan the way I found out about most things in my family. Accidentally, through my mother, who told me not because she wanted my input, but because she wanted me to be appropriately impressed. "Your brother is going to be a partner at a real investment firm," she said, on a phone call in January that I hadn't initiated. "Dennis is helping him get there. It's a big opportunity. I thought you'd want to know." She said it the way you'd tell someone the weather. Informational. Slightly bored. I asked her how much Dennis was putting in. She hesitated, which meant she knew I'd have an opinion. $200,000, she said. From his IRA. Early withdrawal. Colin's going to pay him back double once the distributions start. I sat with that for a moment. 67 years old. IRA withdrawal. That's taxable income. That's a 10% early withdrawal penalty on top of ordinary income tax. That's somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 in taxes and penalties on top of the $200,000 just to hand money to a son who had never once paid back a loan. I told my mother I had concerns. She told me I had always been jealous of Colin's ambition. I didn't argue. I hung up and opened my laptop and started researching Meridian Capital Group. What I found took me about 6 hours to piece together, and what it amounted to was this. Meridian was not what Colin thought it was. The firm was legitimate on paper, incorporated in Delaware, registered with the SEC, all the right logos on the website, but their last 2 fund cycles had significantly underperformed, and they had quietly restructured their partnership model 18 months ago. The new model was, and I want to be precise here, not technically a Ponzi scheme, but it had the same structural problem. They were using fresh capital from new partners to cover the distribution promises they'd made to earlier ones. They needed Colin's money the way a house fire needs oxygen, and they had identified him specifically because he was loud about wanting in and because they'd run a background check and seen that his father had assets. This is called a target. In the industry, we call this a mark. I spent 2 weeks verifying everything. I pulled public filings. I cross-referenced their reported returns against market benchmarks. I talked off the record to a contact at the SEC who confirmed there was an open inquiry. I built a file. It was the most thorough file I'd built in years, because I kept thinking I was wrong, and I kept checking, and I kept not being wrong. And then I spent a week deciding what to do with it. The obvious answer was to call Dennis, tell him what I'd found, send him the file, and let him make his own decision. I drafted that email 4 times. I kept not sending it. Here is the thing about Dennis. He doesn't update. I've tried, over the years, to show him things, accomplishments, evidence, facts, and they simply don't revise his model of the world. He decided who Colin was and who I was a long time ago, and nothing that has happened since has touched that decision. If I sent him the file, he would forward it to Colin, and Colin would tell him I was jealous, and Dennis would agree, and they would proceed with the plan and lose everything. And when it eventually fell apart, Colin would find a way to make that my fault too. So I didn't send it. I did something else. I called a colleague of mine, someone I've worked with for 8 years, who runs the restructuring desk at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte. His name is not important for this story, but what matters is that he is methodical and discreet and has a very authoritative handshake. I told him I had a situation and I needed a favor. He said he owed me 3. Then I called Meridian Capital Group and asked to speak to someone about a potential acquisition. It took 4 days and 2 calls to get to the right person. When I finally did, I was professional and specific. I told them my firm had been monitoring distressed mid-market PE shops in the Southeast and that Meridian's profile had come up in our screening. I was interested in acquiring a controlling stake in their debt structure, which, given their recent fund performance, was substantial. I was not bluffing. I had the capital access to do exactly what I was describing. They didn't say yes immediately. These things never happen immediately. But they said they'd be in touch. 3 weeks later, they were in touch, significantly, desperately in touch. We closed the acquisition in stages. I'll spare you the technical details except to say that what I ended up with was a controlling interest in Meridian's debt, which effectively gave me, through a holding company that did not have my name on the door, approval rights over any new partnership agreements, including the one my brother was scheduled to sign on a Thursday afternoon in March. I arranged to be present at the signing as part of the due diligence team. No one questioned it. No one looked at me twice. And that is how I ended up standing in the back of a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in Nashville, holding a padfolio, watching my brother walk past me without recognizing my face. Colin had dressed for the occasion. Navy suit, new tie, shoes that probably cost $400 based on the sole. He was accompanied by Dennis, who looked smaller than I remembered. Dennis has always been a big man, broad shoulders, the kind of man who takes up space without trying. But he looked diminished somehow, like the intervening years had compressed him slightly. He was wearing his good blazer. I hadn't seen that blazer in a long time. My mother wasn't there. That surprised me. Then it didn't. They were taken to a conference room on the south side of the floor. I followed at a distance and took a seat at the end of the table near the window where the afternoon light was bright enough that they'd have to squint slightly to see me clearly. This was not accidental. The Meridian representative, a man named Garrett, who was their head of investor relations and who was entirely unaware of what was about to happen to his firm, came in and began the preliminary paperwork review. Colin signed things and initialed things and leaned forward with the posture of someone trying to look like they belonged. Dennis watched everything without speaking. About 20 minutes in, Colin turned to Garrett and said something that stopped my breath for a second. He said, "My sister works in finance. She tried to talk me out of this, actually." He said it with a small, confident smile. Said she was worried about the risk profile. He shrugged. "She's always been cautious. It's fine, she just doesn't have the appetite for upside that I do." Garrett nodded politely. Dennis didn't say anything, but he glanced down the table out of habit or instinct, and for a moment his eyes almost found me before they slid past. I looked at my padfolio. About 15 minutes later, during a pause in the document review, my colleague came in. I had briefed him on everything. He was playing the role of senior compliance officer for the acquiring entity, which was not entirely a performance since that was functionally what he was. He set his bag down at the head of the table, introduced himself with the particular energy of someone who does not need the room to like him, and said he needed to conduct a brief verification review before the final signature page. Colin frowned. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked slightly pale. "Standard procedure," my colleague said. "New ownership protocols require verification of all partner liquid assets before any agreement is finalized." He opened his laptop. "We'll need current bank statements, ideally a live screenshot from your banking app or a forwarded PDF from your institution's official portal." Colin reached into his briefcase without missing a beat. He produced a document, printed, crisp. My colleague looked at it for a long time without picking it up. Then he said, "I'll need the digital original. The acquiring entity requires a live document with verifiable metadata. A printed copy doesn't satisfy our compliance requirements." The room went very still. Here is what I knew, that no one else in that room knew yet. Colin didn't have $200,000 in liquid assets. He had approximately $14,000 in a checking account and a car loan with 11 months left on it. The $200,000 that was supposed to be there was Dennis's IRA money, which Dennis had not yet withdrawn because, I later learned, there had been a processing delay at the brokerage. The money was coming, just not yet. Colin had filled the gap. The the same way my brother always fills gaps. With a shortcut. He had taken a legitimate PDF of a brokerage statement, not even his brokerage, a statement he'd apparently found as a template somewhere online, and he had edited the figures using a PDF editing tool. He'd added Dennis's account number. He'd changed the balance to $210,000. He'd changed the name to his own. He had no idea that transmitting a doctored financial document to secure an investment agreement constituted wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. He had no idea that the metadata of a PDF edited in a standard tool retains timestamps and software fingerprints that any forensic accountant can read in about 4 minutes. He had no idea that the senior compliance officer sitting across the table had spent 12 years doing exactly this kind of forensic review before he came to work for me. He just knew that the only way to keep this deal alive in this moment was to send the file. So he did. He forwarded it from his laptop to the email address my colleague provided. My colleague's phone pinged. He opened it. He looked at the document for a moment. He looked at the metadata. He closed the laptop. What happened next was quiet. That's the thing no one tells you about these moments. You'd expect noise. You'd expect drama. But the real ones are quiet. My colleague said, "There appears to be a discrepancy in the document you provided." Colin said, "What kind of discrepancy?" My colleague said, "The file shows it was created 11 days ago in a PDF editing application. The font rendering on the balance figures doesn't match the institution's standard template, and the account number you've listed is associated with a different holder in our system." The room was completely silent. Then I stood up. I want to explain what it felt like to stand up in that room. I had practiced it. I'd imagined this moment probably a dozen times in the past 2 months, but the actual experience of it was different than I'd expected. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even satisfying exactly. It was more like watching something that had been in motion for a very long time finally come to rest. I walked from the end of the table to the center of the room. I set my padfolio down. I looked at Colin first, then at Dennis. Dennis saw my face and went completely still, not surprised. Something different. Something closer to the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for a very specific thing. "Hi," I said. Colin's face did something I don't have words for. It moved through several expressions so quickly they blurred. He landed on something that looked like contempt, because that was the one he had the most practice with. "What are you doing here?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. "I'm the majority creditor of the acquiring entity," I said. "I have been since February." I opened my padfolio and took out 3 documents. I set them on the table in front of Dennis. The first was a summary of the acquisition, what my holding company owned, what that meant in terms of approval authority, and what had triggered the compliance review today. The second was a 1-page summary of Meridian's actual financial position, the underperforming funds, the structural problem with their distribution model, the SEC inquiry. The money Dennis was about to commit would not generate returns. It would paper over someone else's losses and disappear. The third was a printout of the metadata analysis of the document Colin had just emailed. Time of creation. Software used. Discrepancy in the balance field. My colleague had run it on his phone in approximately 3 minutes. I looked at Dennis while he read. I looked at his hands. He has hands like a working man. Wide palms, thick fingers, a small scar on the left thumb from a table saw incident in 1987 that he used to tell stories about. He held the pages carefully, the way he used to hold the newspaper on Sunday mornings when I was small enough to sit on the floor beside his chair and feel like proximity to him meant something. He didn't look at Colin. I let him finish. Then I said, "The document Colin sent constitutes wire fraud. Federal. The statute is 18 U.S.C. 1343. The penalty range is up to 20 years. Colin said, "That's ridiculous. It was a placeholder." I said, "You transmitted it across a digital network to secure a financial agreement. That's not a placeholder. That's a filing." Dennis set down the papers. I said, "I have 2 options I can offer. The The first is that I forward the evidence package to the U.S. Attorney's Office today. The second is that Colin withdraws from the agreement, no charges are filed, and I have a separate conversation with Dennis about restructuring the IRA distribution before it incurs penalties. That last part surprised both of them. I could see it. I had thought about this a lot. I want to be honest about that. I thought about whether I was doing this to protect Dennis or to punish Colin or to prove something, and the answer was not clean. It was all of those things, weighted differently depending on what time of night it was when I was thinking it, but protecting the retirement money was real. Dennis was 67. He had 40 years of careful, unglamorous saving in that account. Whatever he felt about me, whatever he had always felt, I was not willing to watch that disappear because his son needed a title. Colin looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You set this up." I said, "Yes." He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "For about 3 months," he said, and his voice shifted into something uglier. "You've always hated me." I looked at him. I thought about the birthday where I drove 4 hours to attend and he spent the dinner on his phone. I thought about the loan I gave him in 2019, $8,000, which he has never mentioned since. I thought about the Christmas 2 years ago when he told his girlfriend, within my hearing, that his sister was the kind of person who peaked in school because she didn't know how to operate in the real world. "I don't hate you," I said. "I'm indifferent to you." That took a long time, but I got there. Dennis said my name. Just my name! The way he used to say it when I was in trouble as a kid, except now, he was the one who looked like he was in trouble. I said, "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm here because someone needed to stop this before it cost you everything you saved." If it had been anyone else in that building, they would have taken the money and thanked Colin for the easy mark. Dennis looked at the table. He said, "How long have you known what you do? How long have you—" He stopped. He tried again. "This is what you do." "For work," I said. 11 years. He didn't say anything. I said, "You never asked." That sat in the room for a moment. Colin said one more time, his voice smaller now, "I just needed the bridge." The money was coming. I would have made it right. I said, "You transmitted a forged federal document in front of 3 witnesses in order to secure a fraudulent agreement using your father's retirement savings as the underlying collateral. I want you to hear those words in that order." He didn't respond. I gathered the documents. I looked at my colleague and gave him a small nod. He began preparing the withdrawal paperwork, the agreement that would nullify Colin's participation in the Meridian deal, and note the transaction as canceled without prejudice. No partnership, no fraud referral, a clean exit if Colin signed. He signed. His hand was steady, which surprised me. Whatever else Colin is, he is not a coward in the mechanical sense. He doesn't shake, he just doesn't think. I turned to Dennis. I said, "The IRA distribution, if it hasn't processed yet, you can reverse it within 60 days without penalty. I can connect you with a fiduciary advisor who isn't affiliated with any of this. No cost, it's just a phone call." Dennis said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're 67. You need that money to mean something in 15 years. He said, "I haven't done right by you." He said it flat, not as an apology. As a fact, the way a man says something he has finally let himself see clearly, I said, "No, you haven't." I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't. I didn't tell him I forgave him, because I was still working on that and I wasn't going to lie in a conference room in Nashville to make him feel better. What I did was look at him, this smaller, compressed version of the man who had spent 30 years looking past me, and feel something I wasn't expecting. Not satisfaction, something quieter than that. I picked up my padfolio. I said to the room in general, "The Meridian agreement is voided effective today. My team will be in touch with Garrett's office about the transition process. I would recommend engaging counsel before responding to the SEC inquiry when it becomes public, which I expect will be within the next 6 weeks." Garrett, who had said almost nothing since my colleague arrived, looked like a man trying very hard to remember if he'd done anything illegal. He probably had. That wasn't my problem. I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Colin say my name, sharp, like he was calling a dog back. I stopped. I didn't turn around. I said, I spent 11 years building something. I did it alone, and I did it without a single bridge loan or a single safety net or a single person in this family asking how it was going. I don't need you to understand that, but I need you to know it happened. Then I walked out. The elevator lobby was empty. The afternoon sun was coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long horizontal lines, and I stood in one of them for a minute, holding my padfolio, listening to the distant sound of Nashville traffic 23 floors below. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Colin says the deal fell through. Did you have something to do with that? I put the phone back in my pocket. I pressed the elevator button. I thought about the IRA. I thought about 60 days and whether Dennis would actually make the call. I thought about my colleague, who was probably still upstairs explaining the acquisition timeline to a very rattled Garrett. I thought about the drive home, which was 4.5 hours, and whether I'd stop for dinner or just drive straight through. I pressed the button again, which I know does nothing. The elevator came. I didn't look back. I've thought a lot about what I actually wanted walking into that building. I told myself it was about protecting Dennis's retirement, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and I'm not going to pretend it was. Part of me wanted Colin to see me, really see me. Not the sister he walked past in the lobby, not the one he told his girlfriend had peaked in school. The one who had spent 11 years building something real, quietly, without anyone in that family thinking to ask how it was going. Here's what I've come to understand about the way cause and effect actually works. Not in the tidy, moral lesson way people talk about it, but in the real way, the slow way. Colin didn't end up in that room because he was unlucky. He ended up there because for 39 years, every consequence that should have landed on him had been caught by someone else first. Dennis caught them. My mother caught them. The people who lent him money and never saw it again caught them. Consequence requires contact. Colin had been insulated from contact his entire life, and so he kept doing the same things, escalating slightly each time, because nothing had ever pushed back hard enough to make him recalibrate. That's not a character flaw in the dramatic sense, it's just physics. If you remove friction from a system long enough, the system doesn't learn to move carefully, it just moves faster. And I think about Dennis in that conference room reading those pages, 67 years old, hands that built things. 40 years of careful, unglamorous work sitting in an account he'd almost handed over to a man who didn't know the difference between a deed of trust and a promissory note. Dennis didn't end up there because he was a bad person. He ended up there because love, or what he called love, had made him unable to see clearly. He had confused investment with affection for so long that they become the same thing in his mind. And when you do that, when you make your approval conditional on someone's potential rather than their reality, you stop being a parent and start being a creditor. And creditors eventually have to reckon with their balance sheets. I don't say any of this to be cold about it. I say it because I think the hardest thing I've had to learn in my adult life is that intelligence without ethics is just a more sophisticated way of causing harm. Colin was smart enough to find the template, smart enough to edit the numbers, smart enough to print it on good paper. What he didn't have was the willingness to ask himself what he was actually doing to the people around him. That's not a cleverness problem. That's a character problem, and no amount of funding fixes it. What I know about building something real is that it is slow, and it is mostly invisible, and it requires you to keep going on days when no one is watching and no one is clapping, and the person you most wanted to impress has already decided you're not worth the attention. I stacked shelves at a pharmacy at midnight. I ran numbers for people who didn't know my name. I built the kind of competence that doesn't photograph well and doesn't make good dinner conversation, and I did it alone, and it turned out to be enough. That's the thing no one tells you when you're the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one standing in the corner holding the water pitcher. Invisibility cuts both ways. They can't see you coming. I pressed the elevator button. I didn't look back. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to.